The text arrived at 11:17 on a stormy Tuesday night, while Thomas Bennett stood alone in his garage in Evanston, one hand buried inside the rusted engine of a 1972 Chevrolet pickup he had been restoring for nearly 3 years. The message contained only 2 words: Silver Lake. For a moment, Thomas did not move. Rain hammered softly against the roof overhead. Somewhere down the block, thunder rolled across the dark shoreline of Lake Michigan. Motor oil stained his fingers black, but he barely noticed anymore. Every quiet instinct inside him had suddenly gone cold. His daughter Emily had not used those words in 22 years. Not since the winter her mother died. Back then, Emily had been 13 years old and terrified of a world that no longer felt safe. One sleepless night after Susan Bennett's funeral, she had asked her father a question while sitting on the bathroom counter, watching him shave. What if someday I'm too scared to explain what's wrong? So together, they created a code. Silver Lake meant only one thing: don't ask questions. Don't hesitate. Just come. Thomas was 65 now. Retired battalion chief from the Chicago Fire Department, 31 years pulling strangers out of burning buildings had trained him to recognize danger long before anyone spoke it aloud. And the second he saw those 2 words glowing on his phone screen, every instinct he had ever trusted told him exactly the same thing. Something terrible had already happened. He called Emily immediately, straight to voicemail. Again, nothing. By the 3rd call, he was already grabbing his truck keys. Outside, the storm had swallowed the entire neighborhood in sheets of rain and flashing streetlights. Thomas climbed into his old Ford pickup, engine rumbling awake beneath him, and stared one final time at the location pin attached to the message. Naperville, Emily's house. Then he reached for his phone one more time and called the only person he trusted to hear those 2 words without needing an explanation. Jack Morrison answered on the 4th ring, voice rough with sleep. Yeah? Thomas swallowed once. She used the code. Silence. Then Jack spoke quietly. I'll meet you at Interstate 88. And just like that, Thomas drove into the storm, unaware that before the night ended, the life he thought his daughter had built would crack wide open in front of him forever. Thomas Bennett had spent most of retirement trying to learn how to be still. For 31 years, his life had been noise. Sirens, radios, smoke alarms, the roar of collapsing roofs, and screaming engines tearing through downtown Chicago at 2 in the morning. Men shouting over firestorms while oxygen tanks rattled against concrete stairwells. Then suddenly, one day, it all stopped. Now his evenings were usually quiet. Coffee in the garage. Baseball games humming softly through an old radio. Long hours spent restoring engines no one else cared enough to save anymore. Peaceful. At least, that was what he called it. But as Thomas drove west through the pounding rain toward Naperville, he realized something uncomfortable. Peace and denial often wore the same face. Windshield wipers slapped furiously back and forth while headlights smeared across flooded pavement. The storm had turned Interstate 88 into a river of red brake lights and blurred reflections. Jack Morrison's gray SUV waited beneath an overpass near the exit ramp. Jack climbed into the passenger seat without wasting a word. Retired detective. 26 years with the Chicago Police Department. Thick shoulders gone slightly softer with age, but his eyes remained sharp enough to cut through excuses before people finished speaking them. She answer? Jack asked. Thomas shook his head. Jack leaned back quietly. How long since she used it? 22 years. That earned silence. Thomas kept driving. Outside, lightning briefly illuminated miles of soaked highway barriers and dark industrial buildings, sliding past them in flashes. Inside the truck, old blues music crackled faintly through one damaged speaker, but Thomas barely heard it, because now that he allowed himself to look backward honestly, the warning signs appeared everywhere. Emily apologizing constantly for things that required no apology. Ryan Cooper correcting her in front of people, with that calm, humiliating tone, disguised as concern. Lily going completely silent anytime Ryan raised his voice, even slightly. Last Thanksgiving, Ryan had criticized Emily's cooking in front of the entire family. Not loudly, worse than loudly, precisely. Like a man carefully placing a thumb against someone's throat, just hard enough for only they could feel it. Thomas remembered watching Emily laugh it off while carrying plates into the kitchen. Her hands had been trembling. He had seen it and done nothing. I should have asked more questions, Thomas muttered suddenly. Jack stared through the rain-streaked windshield for a long moment before answering. Most people don't, he said quietly. Not until somebody finally gets hurt badly enough they can't ignore it anymore. Thomas tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, his daughter had sent the one message she swore she would never need. And deep down, he already feared he was arriving years too late. The subdivision looked almost peaceful from the outside. Identical two-story homes lined the wet streets of Naperville like carefully arranged pieces on a showroom floor. Porch lights glowed softly through the rain. Decorative trees swayed beneath the storm winds. Expensive SUVs sat gleaming beneath driveways flooded with reflected lightning. The kind of neighborhood people pointed at and called successful. Thomas hated how quickly appearances could lie. He parked halfway down Emily's street and killed the headlights. For a moment, neither he nor Jack moved. Rain hammered against the truck roof in steady waves. Then they heard it, shouting. Muffled at first, then louder. A man's voice, sharp, angry, controlled in the way rage sometimes became most dangerous. Jack slowly turned toward Thomas. You want me to call patrol now? Thomas was already opening the truck door. I'm done waiting. Cold rain soaked through his jacket instantly as he crossed the lawn. Jack followed beside him without hesitation, boots splashing across flooded grass. Halfway to the porch, something shattered inside the house. Glass. Then silence. Then a child crying, not loudly. Worse. The restrained, frightened sound children make after learning loud crying only makes adults angrier. Something inside Thomas went completely still. He reached the front door and pushed it open without knocking. The smell hit first. Whiskey, burned food, fear. The living room lights were dim, except for the bright kitchen overheads spilling across broken glass scattered near the dining table. Emily stood near the counter with one arm wrapped tightly around her ribs. Blood stained the corner of her lower lip. Behind her, 7-year-old Lily clung desperately to the back of her mother's sweater, wearing pink pajamas covered in tiny snowflakes. And standing near the kitchen island, bourbon glass still in hand, was Ryan Cooper. For half a second, surprise crossed Ryan's face. Then calculation replaced it. Thomas, he said quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded painfully rehearsed. This isn't what it looks like. Thomas had heard that sentence hundreds of times in his career. Apartment fires started by small accidents. Drunk drivers who barely touched another vehicle. Men standing beside bruised women insisting everyone was exaggerating. It was always exactly what it looked like. Lily saw her grandfather and broke immediately. "Grandpa!" She ran toward him hard enough to nearly knock him backward. Thomas dropped to one knee and caught her against his chest. Her entire body shook violently beneath the soaked blanket sleeper. Not temporary fear. Conditioned fear, the kind children carried after living beside anger too long. Jack quietly crouched beside them. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly. Think you can help me find some juice in the kitchen? Lily nodded weakly. Jack guided her gently toward the refrigerator, giving Thomas a clear line of sight across the room. Emily still couldn't fully meet her father's eyes. That hurt worse than the blood. Ryan spread his hands dramatically. Couples argue. Things got heated. Emily threw a plate first. Thomas noticed it immediately. The flinch, tiny, fast, almost invisible. But Emily's shoulders contracted the second Ryan raised his voice. 31 years inside burning buildings had taught Thomas something most people never learned. Fear had body language, and his daughter wore it like a second skin. "We're taking Emily and Lily home tonight," Thomas said calmly. Ryan laughed once. Short, ugly. "You can't just walk in here and—" Emily took a small step toward the hallway. Ryan grabbed her wrist hard enough to make her gasp. The room changed instantly. Thomas moved before he fully realized he had crossed the distance between them. At 65, he no longer moved fast often, but some instincts never retired. He stopped inches from Ryan's face. "Take your hand off my daughter." Quiet voice, deadly calm. Ryan smirked nervously, trying to recover control. "Or what? You gonna arrest me, old man?" A new voice answered from behind them. "No," Jack said evenly. "But somebody else might." Red and blue lights flashed silently through the rain outside the front windows. Ryan's expression finally cracked for the first time that night. The patrol officers arrived quietly. No sirens. Just flashing lights reflecting across rain-soaked windows while the storm rolled over the neighborhood outside. Thomas stood beside Emily near the kitchen while two officers spoke separately with Ryan in the living room. Jack remained close to Lily, keeping her distracted with juice boxes and quiet conversation about cartoons and school lunches. Ryan had transformed completely within minutes. That frightened Thomas more than the yelling. One moment Ryan had been raging through broken glass and whiskey fumes. The next, he wore the exhausted expression of a patient husband dealing with a dramatic misunderstanding. Controlled voice, measured sighs, carefully chosen words. "I think emotions just escalated tonight," Ryan explained to one officer while rubbing both hands over his face theatrically. "Emily's been under a lot of stress lately." Thomas watched the performance with growing disgust, because that was exactly what it was, a performance. The younger officer finally turned toward Emily at the kitchen table. "Ma'am," he said gently, "did your husband hit you tonight?" The room went still. Emily stared down at the frozen bag of peas pressed against her cheek. Long silence. Then came the answer Thomas feared most. "We both got upset." The officer nodded slowly, clearly recognizing the pattern. But without full cooperation, there was little immediate action they could legally take, beyond documenting the incident and recommending separation for the evening. Ryan understood that too. Thomas could see it in his eyes. The confidence returning. The belief that he still controlled the gravity inside this house. Emily quietly packed 2 overnight bags, while Ryan followed her through the hallway, speaking in soft, poisonous sentences, carefully designed to sound reasonable. "You're scaring Lily. You're overreacting. You know your father always hated me. Families fight, Emily." Every sentence sounded calm enough for outsiders, but Thomas noticed what mattered. Emily shaking harder after every word. Lily, watching her parents with terrified silence, far too mature for a 7-year-old child. When Emily finally zipped Lily's backpack near the staircase, Ryan suddenly softened his voice completely. "Come on, Em," he whispered. "Don't do this." For one awful second, Thomas saw hesitation cross his daughter's face. Not because she believed Ryan, because fear and love became tangled after enough years together. Then Lily quietly reached for her mother's hand, and Emily chose her daughter. "We're leaving," she said softly. The drive back to Evanston felt endless. Rain battered the highway the entire way, while Lily slept curled beneath a blanket in the back seat beside Jack. Exhaustion had finally pulled her unconscious somewhere near Aurora. Emily barely spoke. She sat staring through the passenger window as miles of wet pavement and empty gas stations slid past them beneath flashes of lightning. Thomas kept both hands tight on the steering wheel because if he loosened them even slightly, he feared the anger inside him might finally break loose. Not just anger toward Ryan, toward himself. Every ignored instinct, every uncomfortable moment he had politely stepped around. Every holiday dinner where Emily smiled too quickly. Every time Lily became unnaturally quiet. Peace and denial, same face. They reached Thomas's small lakeside home shortly after 2 in the morning. The old house sat near the water, behind a row of dark maple trees swaying violently in the storm winds. Emily used to love this neighborhood as a little girl, back when life still felt safe. Jack carried the sleeping Lily inside, while Thomas quietly made coffee in the kitchen. Emily sat at the table, holding the warm mug with both hands, but never drank from it. The house remained silent, except for rain tapping against the windows. Jack finally stood near the front door around 3:30. "This didn't start tonight," he said quietly. "No," Thomas admitted. Jack studied him carefully. "How long you think?" Thomas looked toward Emily, sitting motionless beneath the kitchen light. "Longer than I let myself admit." Jack nodded once. "I'll start looking into Ryan tomorrow." Then he disappeared into the storm. Thomas never went to bed. Around 4:15 in the morning, Emily finally spoke, very softly. "Dad?" Thomas looked up. She stared down into untouched coffee. "Do you think less of me for staying?" Thomas thought Emily's question might break him. "Do you think less of me for staying?" The kitchen suddenly felt too small for the amount of pain sitting inside it. Outside, dawn had not yet reached the shoreline of Evanston. The world beyond the windows remained dark and soaked with rain, the lake invisible somewhere beyond the trees. Thomas leaned back slowly in his chair and looked at his daughter carefully. At 35, Emily still carried traces of the little girl who used to fall asleep on his shoulder during long drives home from school. But exhaustion had hollowed something inside her now. Fear had a way of shrinking people gradually until even their own reflections stopped feeling familiar. "I hate that you thought you needed to ask me that," Thomas said quietly. Emily pressed trembling fingers against her eyes. Then finally she cried, not loudly, not dramatically. The exhausted kind of crying that came after years of holding emotions together so tightly that letting go felt almost dangerous. And once she started talking, the truth came slowly but relentlessly. Ryan monitored her phone constantly, checked bank transactions, criticized her weight, picked fights before family gatherings so she would appear emotional afterward, mocked her parenting, made her feel guilty for spending money on herself. "He always said I was too sensitive," Emily whispered. "Eventually, I stopped trusting my own reactions." Thomas listened in silence while something heavy settled deeper and deeper into his chest. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "He hit me the first time when Lily was 18 months old." Thomas stood so abruptly his chair nearly tipped backward. He walked straight through the kitchen, through the mudroom, and into the garage without a word. The cold air hit his face hard. For several seconds he simply stood there, staring at shelves lined with old tools and dusty paint cans. Then he slammed his fist against a steel storage cabinet hard enough to dent the metal. Pain shot violently through his knuckles. Good. He welcomed it, because it felt easier to survive than the guilt. A few moments later, Emily appeared quietly in the garage doorway. "You never hit, Mom," she said softly. Thomas closed his eyes. "No," he answered. "But apparently I missed a hell of a lot anyway." The following afternoon, Jack Morrison arrived carrying 2 coffees and a thick legal pad already filled with notes. Retirement had not slowed Jack's instincts either. He spread several printed documents across Thomas's dining table, while Emily sat nearby holding Lily's coloring book absent-mindedly in her lap. "I started with public records and financial trails," Jack explained calmly. Then he slid the first photo across the table. Ryan Cooper standing beside a blonde woman outside an upscale rooftop restaurant in downtown Chicago, both smiling, too comfortably. Emily stared at the image for several seconds without breathing. "Olivia Parker," Jack said. "Married. Husband's a commercial attorney." Thomas felt nausea twist inside him. But Jack wasn't finished. Hotel receipts, expense reports, private apartment payments, luxury restaurant charges. Then finally, one line highlighted in yellow marker: education fund withdrawal transfers. Emily's face went completely white. "Oh my God." Thomas frowned. "What is that?" Emily looked physically sick now. "That account was supposed to be for Lily's college." Silence filled the room. Thomas slowly sat down because his knees no longer felt stable beneath him. He had started that account the week Emily graduated high school. Every overtime shift after Susan died, every birthday contribution, every Christmas deposit, years of sacrifice quietly stored away for his granddaughter's future. And Ryan had been draining it for affairs, trips, luxury weekends. Thomas stared at the paperwork while shame crawled through him like fire. Because he had trusted Ryan, recommended him professionally, opened doors for him, defended him. Meanwhile, Emily had been clipping grocery coupons while Ryan spent stolen money pretending to be successful. A knock interrupted the silence. Jack glanced toward the door. "That'll be Rebecca Hayes." The family attorney entered, carrying a leather briefcase and calm eyes sharpened by years of divorce courtrooms and damaged families. She sat down quietly, read every document, then looked directly at Emily. "What your husband has done goes far beyond infidelity," Rebecca said evenly. Emily swallowed hard. Rebecca folded her hands carefully. "The real question now is this." She leaned forward slightly. "Are you ready to stop protecting him?" For the next several days, the house near the lake slowly began breathing differently. Not peacefully, not yet, but differently. Thomas noticed it first in the mornings. Lily no longer froze whenever footsteps crossed the hallway. Emily stopped apologizing every time she opened the refrigerator or used the washing machine, as though existing inside someone else's home required permission. Tiny changes, fragile ones, but real. Outside, spring rain continued sweeping across Evanston in gray waves rolling off Lake Michigan. Inside the house, Rebecca Hayes began helping Emily untangle years of quiet financial control, one document at a time. New checking account, new passwords, separate credit monitoring, phone records, cloud backups. At first, even small decisions overwhelmed Emily. Thomas noticed how she hesitated before signing simple paperwork, instinctively waiting for someone else's approval before answering basic questions. Rebecca noticed it too. "That's normal," she told her gently one afternoon at the dining room table. "Control changes the way people think about themselves." Emily looked embarrassed. "I used to be independent." "You still are," Rebecca corrected calmly. "You've just spent years surviving somebody else's version of reality." Meanwhile, Ryan Cooper began calling constantly. At first, the messages sounded apologetic. "I miss you. We can fix this. Lily needs both parents." Then came guilt. "You're humiliating me. You know your father always hated me. You're destroying this family over one bad night." Then finally, the anger arrived. Cold, sharp, predictable. One evening, Thomas found Emily sitting motionless at the kitchen counter, staring at her phone, with tears quietly rolling down her face. He reached for the device before she could stop him. The text message glowed across the screen. "You really think anybody else would want you now?" For one dangerous second, Thomas felt 30 years of discipline nearly disappear. Heat rushed violently through his chest. Not theatrical anger, not shouting. Something much worse, the kind of rage that arrived silently. He stood abruptly and walked out onto the back porch, overlooking the dark water beyond the trees. Cold wind hit his face immediately. Behind him, the sliding door opened softly. Jack Morrison stepped outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Rebecca showed me the message," Jack said quietly. Thomas accepted the cup without speaking. For a long moment, both men simply stared toward the black shoreline. Finally, Thomas muttered, "I swear to God, Jack." "I know." "No," Thomas said tightly. "You don't." Jack looked at him carefully. "You think you're the first father who wanted to break somebody apart for hurting his kid?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "Right now, I understand exactly how men ruin their own lives in 10 seconds. Jack nodded once. "That's why you won't." Silence settled between them. Somewhere out across the water, a foghorn echoed faintly through the night. Thomas rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. "I spent 31 years teaching rookies how panic kills people inside burning buildings," he said quietly. "Move too fast, stop thinking, and suddenly everybody dies." Jack sipped his coffee. Same principle here. Inside the house, Lily's laughter suddenly floated faintly from the living room television. Small, careful, but real. Thomas closed his eyes briefly at the sound, because that laughter had been missing for longer than he realized. The next morning, Emily attended her first therapy appointment. She nearly canceled twice before leaving. Thomas noticed how tightly she gripped the steering wheel while backing out of the driveway. Fear again. Not fear of Ryan. Fear of becoming someone separate from him. That was the part outsiders rarely understood. Leaving wasn't a single decision. It was hundreds of terrifying little decisions afterward. When Emily returned 2 hours later, she looked emotionally exhausted, but strangely lighter around the edges. "How was it?" Thomas asked carefully. Emily stood quietly in the kitchen, removing her coat. "Hard," she admitted. Then, after a long pause, "But maybe the kind of hard that finally leads somewhere better." That evening, while helping Lily with homework at the dining room table, Emily's phone buzzed once more. Another message from Ryan. This time there were only 4 words. "You'll come back eventually." Emily stared at the screen for several seconds, then slowly locked the phone. "No," she whispered to herself. For the first time since arriving at the lake house, Thomas believed she might actually mean it. 3 weeks later, Ryan Cooper still believed he could control the story. That was the dangerous thing about men like him. They confused performance with reality for so long that eventually they stopped recognizing the difference themselves. On paper, his life still looked polished. Regional finance director, tailored suits, country club memberships, professional charity events in downtown Chicago. The kind of man who shook hands firmly and remembered people's birthdays. But quietly, underneath all of it, the foundation had already started cracking. Rebecca Hayes moved carefully, not dramatically. Thomas learned quickly that experienced attorneys rarely behaved like television lawyers. No shouting, no surprise courtroom speeches, just patience, paperwork, and pressure applied in exactly the right places. Jack Morrison helped gather the rest. Corporate expense reports, hotel reimbursements, private apartment lease records tied to hidden accounts, transfers connected to Lily's education fund. Every piece organized quietly into folders that grew thicker each week. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Rebecca arrived at Thomas's house, carrying a dark leather briefcase and a tired expression. "He got sloppy," she said simply, while laying documents across the dining table. Emily looked up nervously. "What does that mean?" "It means he stopped believing anyone would ever question him." Rebecca opened one folder after another. Luxury hotel stays billed as corporate conferences. Weekend travel disguised as client meetings. Restaurant charges linked directly to Olivia Parker. Thomas stared at the paperwork in disbelief, not because Ryan had done it, because he had done it so casually, as though nobody else in the world mattered enough to notice. Jack leaned back in his chair. "People like Ryan usually don't collapse all at once. First, they get arrogant." Emily sat quietly beside the window, twisting her wedding ring slowly around her finger. Thomas noticed she had started doing that whenever conversations drifted toward legal proceedings. Fear again. Not fear of losing Ryan anymore. Fear of becoming responsible for destroying the life she once fought desperately to protect. Rebecca noticed too. "This isn't your fault," she said firmly. Emily looked down. "It still feels like it is." Rebecca closed the folder gently. "That feeling is exactly how manipulation survives." The room fell silent. Outside, wind rattled branches against the lakeside windows, while gray clouds rolled low across the water. Then Jack finally spoke again. "There's a charity gala next Saturday at the Langham, Chicago." Thomas frowned slightly. "What kind of gala?" "Hospitals, Children's Foundation, corporate donors." Jack slid another paper forward. "Ryan's company is sponsoring part of it." Rebecca nodded once. "And according to these emails, Ryan believes he's being considered for a promotion announcement there." Thomas almost laughed. The timing felt unreal. Emily looked confused. "Why does that matter?" Jack exchanged a glance with Rebecca before answering carefully. "Because his company's internal investigators are almost finished reviewing the expense fraud." The realization slowly crossed Emily's face. "They know?" Rebecca folded her hands calmly. "They know enough." Thomas leaned back quietly. For the first time since the night of the storm, he felt something shifting beneath the surface of everything. Not revenge. Consequences. Slow ones. Real ones. Meanwhile, Ryan continued texting Emily as though control still belonged to him. One day, apologizing. The next, threatening custody battles. Then suddenly, sending old photographs from vacations years earlier. Emotional whiplash, designed to exhaust her until thinking clearly became impossible. But something had changed now. Emily no longer answered immediately. Sometimes, not at all. And every time she ignored him, Ryan pushed harder. Thomas saw the pattern clearly. Control slipping frightened Ryan more than losing the marriage itself. 2 nights before the gala, Emily stood beside the kitchen sink, staring out toward the dark lake. "What if he hates me forever?" she asked quietly. Thomas looked up from the newspaper in his lap. "He already chose who he wanted to be," he answered softly. Emily swallowed hard. "I used to think if I just loved him enough, eventually he'd calm down." Thomas watched rain slide slowly down the windows. "Fireworks the same way sometimes," he said after a long silence. "People think if they stand still long enough, maybe the flames will eventually burn themselves out." Emily looked at him. "But they don't," Thomas continued quietly. "They just keep spreading until somebody finally decides to leave the building." For the first time in weeks, Emily nodded without arguing. And somewhere deep inside himself, Thomas realized his daughter was finally beginning to walk toward the exit. The ballroom inside the Langham, Chicago, glittered with expensive confidence. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors, while waiters moved silently between tables, carrying champagne and carefully arranged plates of salmon beneath soft, golden lighting. Wealthy donors laughed too loudly near the bar. Corporate executives adjusted cufflinks and exchanged business cards with polished smiles, perfected through decades of networking events. Thomas Bennett hated rooms like this, not because of the money, because of the pretending. He stood near the back wall, wearing a dark blazer and gray slacks, looking exactly like what most people assumed he was. Somebody's retired relative invited out of obligation. Perfect. Beside the bar, Jack Morrison nursed a club soda while quietly scanning the room with retired detective patience. Rebecca Hayes moved through conversations smoothly, calm as ever, carrying herself with the kind of confidence that came from already knowing how situations ended before everyone else did. At precisely 8 o'clock, Ryan Cooper entered the ballroom, and for one painful second, Thomas almost understood how Emily had once fallen in love with him. Ryan looked composed. Charcoal suit, perfect tie, relaxed smile. Olivia Parker walked beside him, wearing a silver dress and nervous eyes that never seemed to stop searching the room. Ryan immediately slipped into performance mode. Handshakes, laughter, confident stories about future business growth. The version of himself he desperately needed the world to keep believing in. Thomas watched quietly from across the room, because firefighters learned something important very early in life. Buildings often looked strongest seconds before collapse. Eventually, Ryan noticed him. The smile faltered. Not fear, annoyance. Like spotting mud tracked across a clean floor. Ryan crossed the ballroom carrying a bourbon glass in one hand. "Well," he said with forced amusement, "didn't expect to see you here tonight." Thomas sipped his water calmly. "Traffic wasn't too bad coming downtown." Ryan's jaw tightened slightly. He leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound private while still ensuring nearby people could overhear pieces of it. "Emily's going through a difficult emotional phase right now," he said carefully. "I'd appreciate it if you stopped encouraging the drama." Thomas looked directly into his eyes. "My daughter's been calmer these past 3 weeks than she's been in years." For the first time all evening, something unstable flickered behind Ryan's smile. But before he could answer, movement near the ballroom entrance shifted the atmosphere entirely. A tall man in a navy suit entered, with controlled fury written across every line of his body. Michael Carter, Olivia Parker's husband. Olivia saw him immediately. Color drained from her face. Michael walked directly toward her without hesitation. No shouting. No dramatic scene, just 4 cold words spoken quietly enough that only nearby guests heard them. "We're leaving, right now." Ryan stepped forward instantly. "Michael, this isn't—" Michael turned slowly toward him. The disgust in his expression silenced the sentence before it finished. "6 months of hotel rooms billed through your corporate accounts," Michael said evenly. "I think explanations can wait." Conversations nearby began dying mid-sentence. People always sensed blood in the water before anyone openly acknowledged it. Then came the second crack. 2 men wearing dark corporate security jackets entered from a side hallway. One approached Ryan cautiously. "Mr. Cooper," he said professionally, "we need to discuss several financial discrepancies involving your expense reports." Ryan laughed too loudly. "What? Right now?" His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Nearby executives suddenly became fascinated with their phones. Nobody met his eyes anymore, because the room had already decided which version of Ryan Cooper was real. And then Emily walked in, beside Rebecca Hayes. Simple navy dress, hair pulled back softly. No fear, no apology, just calm. Ryan saw her, and everything inside him visibly shifted. Panic now. Real panic. He moved toward her quickly. "Emily, tell them this is completely blown out of proportion." His voice had lost control entirely now. Too loud. Too desperate. The ballroom quieted almost completely. Emily stood perfectly still. Then she spoke, and unlike Ryan, she did not need volume to command the room. "I stayed silent for years. Because I thought protecting you would protect our family. Ryan froze. Emily's voice remained calm. But I'm done doing that now. The silence afterward felt enormous. No screaming, no theatrics, just truth, finally spoken out loud where everyone could hear it. Security stepped closer. Ryan looked toward Thomas desperately then, as though another man might still save him from consequences he spent years earning. Thomas said nothing, because some buildings could no longer be rescued, only evacuated before the collapse buried everyone inside them. The collapse itself happened quickly. The aftermath did not. Television taught people to expect dramatic endings. Handcuffs, courtroom speeches, instant justice wrapped neatly inside 2 hours of music and closing credits. Real life moved slower than that, painfully slower. Over the following months, Ryan Cooper's life unraveled through paperwork, investigations, and quiet institutional decisions made behind conference room doors. His company terminated him after confirming fraudulent expense claims connected to corporate accounts. The divorce proceedings dragged forward, one exhausting hearing at a time. Custody negotiations became complicated. Financial audits uncovered more hidden debt than anyone initially realized. And through all of it, Emily discovered something she had not expected. Freedom still hurt. Some mornings, Thomas found her standing silently in the kitchen of the lake house in Evanston, staring into coffee gone cold 20 minutes earlier. Not because she missed Ryan, because rebuilding a life required energy. Abuse slowly drained from people over years. Therapy helped, but therapy also opened rooms inside her she had spent years desperately trying to keep locked. One evening after a session, Emily sat beside Thomas on the back porch overlooking the dark water. The wind coming off Lake Michigan carried the sharp smell of rain and distant boats rocking softly against wooden docks. I thought leaving would feel victorious, Emily admitted quietly. Thomas listened without interrupting. She pulled her sweatshirt tighter around herself. But mostly it just feels exhausting. Thomas nodded slowly. After big fires, he said softly, people always expect relief once the flames are out. Emily looked at him. But what usually comes first is shock. Then cleanup. Then realizing how much rebuilding actually costs. For a long moment, neither spoke. Inside the house, Lily laughed loudly at a cartoon playing in the living room. Not nervous laughter, real laughter. The kind children made when they no longer monitored every sound around them. Thomas noticed Emily smiling faintly at it too. Small, but genuine. That became the pattern of recovery. Tiny moments arriving quietly. Lily sleeping through the night again. Emily answering phone calls from old friends she had gradually stopped speaking to during the marriage. Saturday morning pancakes. Movie nights beneath blankets during storms. Ordinary peace returning one careful layer at a time. Thomas rebuilt Lily's education account slowly, partially through settlement money Rebecca Hayes helped recover, partially through his pension savings, partially through overtime consulting jobs he quietly accepted from former fire department contacts. He never told Emily how many extra hours he worked. He simply wanted one thing restored in this family that Ryan had tried to steal: a future. One warm Sunday afternoon, Thomas sat on the front porch, pretending to read, while Lily practiced riding her bicycle in the driveway. Emily jogged beside her, holding the back of the seat. "Keep pedaling," Emily laughed. "I am pedaling." "You're staring at the mailbox again." Lily swerved dramatically before correcting herself at the last second. Thomas smiled despite himself. Then suddenly, Emily let go. For 3 full seconds, Lily rode completely on her own before realizing it. Excitement exploded across her face. "Mom, did you see that?" Emily laughed harder than Thomas had heard her laugh in years. Color had finally started returning to her face lately. Not happiness all the time. Something healthier. Safety. Thomas understood the difference now. Fear exhaustion looked different from ordinary exhaustion. One hollowed people out. The other simply meant they were living again. Later that evening, Emily sat beside him on the porch steps, while Lily chased fireflies across the yard. "Therapy said something interesting today," she said quietly. Thomas glanced toward her. She said, "Surviving something isn't the same thing as healing from it." Thomas considered that for a moment, then nodded. "Fires work like that too," he said. "Sometimes the structure still looks standing afterward." Emily followed his gaze toward the dark trees moving softly in the wind. "But the damage underneath keeps spreading unless somebody actually repairs it." She leaned her head gently against his shoulder. For the first time since the night of the storm, neither of them spoke about Ryan afterward, and somehow that silence finally felt healthy instead of afraid. By the end of August, the lake house finally sounded alive again. Windows stayed open longer now. Music occasionally drifted from the kitchen while Emily cooked dinner. Lily left crayons scattered across the dining room table without apologizing for the mess every 5 minutes. Even the air inside the house felt different, lighter somehow, as if fear itself had finally packed its bags and moved out. Not gone completely, but weakening. Thomas noticed healing rarely arrived dramatically. Usually it returned through ordinary things people almost overlooked. Longer laughter, better sleep, silence that no longer felt dangerous. The divorce proceedings continued moving slowly through the courts in Chicago. But Rebecca Hayes remained optimistic. Ryan's financial records had become increasingly difficult for his attorneys to defend, especially after additional expense fraud surfaced during discovery. Ryan himself had mostly disappeared from public view. No more polished social media posts, no more charity galas, no more carefully rehearsed confidence. Jack occasionally updated Thomas with small bits of information gathered through mutual contacts. Ryan had moved into a furnished apartment near the outskirts of the city. Several former friends had quietly distanced themselves. Apparently, even people skilled at ignoring warning signs eventually became uncomfortable standing too close to collapse. Thomas didn't celebrate any of it. Consequences were necessary, but satisfaction was different from healing. One humid evening near the end of summer, Thomas sat alone on the back porch watching boats drift slowly across the dark water beyond the marina lights. Crickets hummed softly through the trees. Inside, Emily and Lily were asleep upstairs. His phone rang unexpectedly. Blocked number. Thomas almost ignored it. Something made him answer anyway. "Hello?" Several seconds of silence followed. Then Ryan Cooper spoke. Thomas barely recognized the voice. Gone was the polished certainty. Gone was the sharp edge beneath every sentence. Ryan sounded tired now, smaller. "Can I talk to Emily?" Thomas leaned back slowly in the porch chair. "No." Silence again. Then Ryan exhaled shakily through the phone. "I figured you'd say that." Thomas said nothing. For a while, neither man spoke at all. Finally, Ryan muttered quietly, "I did love her." The words floated into the night air and disappeared somewhere above the dark water. Thomas stared out toward the marina lights for a long moment before answering. "I think maybe part of you believes that." Ryan sounded confused by the response. "What's that supposed to mean?" Thomas rubbed one tired hand across his jaw. "In 31 years with the fire department," he said slowly, "I saw people stand outside burning buildings, insisting everything inside could still be saved." Ryan stayed silent. Thomas continued, "Wanting something doesn't mean you protected it." Wind moved softly through the trees overhead. Then Ryan's voice hardened slightly again. "She turned everyone against me." Thomas almost laughed, not because it was funny, because even now, Ryan still searched for a version of reality where accountability belonged to somebody else. "No," Thomas said quietly. Your actions did that. Another silence followed, longer this time. Finally, Ryan spoke again, softer now. I know I made mistakes. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. Mistakes. Forgotten anniversaries were mistakes. Bad investments were mistakes. Years of manipulation, humiliation, fear, and violence were choices, and somehow Ryan still could not fully separate the difference. You still destroyed her, Thomas said calmly. The sentence landed heavily between them. For the first time since the conversation began, Ryan had no immediate answer ready. No charm, no excuse, no performance left, just breathing. Thomas looked back through the glass doors toward the warm kitchen light glowing softly inside the house. Safety lived there now, fragile, hard-earned safety. And suddenly he realized something important. He no longer hated Ryan. Hatred required emotional energy Ryan no longer deserved. What remained instead was clarity, quiet, final. I won't let you hurt them again, Thomas said. Then he ended the call. No anger, no threats, just the soft sound of a door closing permanently on a chapter that should have ended years earlier. Out near the dock, water tapped gently against wooden posts beneath the fading summer wind, and for the first time in a very long while, Thomas Bennett felt absolutely certain the worst part was finally behind them. October arrived quietly along the shoreline of Evanston. The air turned colder. Leaves gathered across sidewalks in drifting piles of red and gold. Boats disappeared gradually from the marina as summer residents prepared for winter. Mornings smelled like rain, coffee, and distant wood smoke rolling in from somewhere farther inland. And for the first time in years, Thomas Bennett's home finally felt peaceful in a way that did not require anyone pretending. Real peace turned out to sound surprisingly ordinary. Cabinet doors opening downstairs before sunrise. Lily laughing too loudly during cartoons. Emily singing absent-mindedly while making coffee because she no longer spent every morning preparing emotionally for someone else's mood. No tension hiding beneath the silence. No fear listening from the next room. One Saturday afternoon, Thomas sat beside Lily at the end of the marina dock, eating melting cherry popsicles beneath a pale autumn sky. Lily kicked her sneakers lightly above the water. Grandpa? Yeah, kiddo? She studied her melting popsicle with enormous seriousness. Mom says you saved us. Thomas smiled faintly. Out across the water, small waves rolled softly against the wooden posts below them. No, he said gently. I just drove somewhere when I was supposed to. Lily thought about that carefully for several seconds, then nodded as though the answer made complete sense to her. Children understood truth faster than adults sometimes. Behind them, Emily walked slowly down the dock, carrying 3 paper cups of hot chocolate from the small marina cafe nearby. Wind pushed loose strands of hair across her face, while sunlight reflected softly off the water behind her. Thomas watched his daughter approach and noticed something that still caught him off guard sometimes. She looked lighter, not perfect, not untouched. Healing did not erase damage, but she no longer looked afraid of existing inside her own life. That mattered. Emily handed Lily a cup carefully before sitting beside Thomas near the edge of the dock. For a while, the 3 of them simply watched gulls circle above the lake in comfortable silence. Then Emily spoke quietly. You know what therapy keeps asking me? Thomas glanced sideways. What? She smiled faintly. Why I ignored the warning signs for so long. Thomas looked back out across the water. A year earlier, that question might have filled him with guilt sharp enough to ruin an entire day. Now the answer felt clearer. Because love makes people hopeful, he said softly. And hope can be blinding when you're scared of losing someone. Emily nodded slowly. I kept thinking if I stayed calmer, if I argued less, Maybe eventually things would go back to normal. Thomas sighed quietly. People say that after fires, too. Emily looked toward him. They stand outside the building saying, "Maybe it's not as bad as it looks." He paused briefly. Sometimes people stay too long because admitting danger means admitting their whole life may need to change. Wind moved gently across the marina. Lily leaned sleepily against Emily's shoulder, sipping hot chocolate, while gulls cried somewhere overhead. Thomas realized then that this was the part nobody talked about enough. Not the dramatic rescues, not the confrontations, the rebuilding afterward, the ordinary moments returning, slowly enough that one day you suddenly noticed you had gone an entire afternoon without fear entering the room first. That was healing, not perfection, safety. As the sun lowered across the lake, Emily rested her head briefly against her father's shoulder. "Thank you for coming that night," she whispered. Thomas looked toward the darkening water for a long moment before answering. The truth still hurt, because even now he knew he should have come sooner, should have asked harder questions, should have trusted his instincts years earlier. Showing up mattered, but showing up earlier mattered more. Finally, he squeezed Emily's hand gently. "Next time," he said softly, "we ask the uncomfortable questions before somebody needs an emergency code." The marina lights flickered on, one by one, across the shoreline. Water rocked quietly beneath the dock, and for the first time in a very long while, the silence around them no longer sounded like something waiting to break.